Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 3 game from the Grenke Chess Open. Now, if you followed the round 2 video, you know that I won a fairly clean game against a lower rated German player, and in this one I was hoping to kind of keep that trend going and stay on the right track. Now, I actually was playing down again in this one, and I think part of the reason for that is because there was actually a very, very large open section, and I was on the top half of that open section, so I actually was going to play down for a few rounds after that first round draw, which is a little bit surprising. Normally, you wind up playing down for only one round, but I actually had to play down multiple rounds. Now, my opponent in this one was an individual by the name of Rudi Hoerstmann, and it happened to be my third German player in a row. So very, very surprising, course of events where, you're playing in an open tournament where you might think there's a really international audience and there were players from all over the world playing. But in fact, I drew Germans all 3 rounds, and it's not a huge surprise given the fact that it took place in Germany, so there are a ton of German participants, but still something of note. In any case, I was white, and my opponent was about 2250, so I think I should, on paper, I was supposed to beat him, but again, you never take anything super lightly, and I knew I had to be on my P's and Q's in this one. So anyways, I opted for d4. Rudi went g6, and this was already a first surprise for me because, g6 kind of invites me to play e4 and shift to an e4 opening that's reminiscent of like the modern or the Perk. So I had to decide, well, do I want to play c4 or do I want to play e4? I decided to play c4 and keep it in the realm of a d4 territory type of opening. And now bishop g7 was played. And here I had another important decision to make, believe it or not, on move 3, because normally you might want to play knight c3, but knight c3 actually allows c5, and this line after d5 and bishop takes c3 check is actually quite tricky. Even though white gets the bishop pair, the spoiled pawn structure is something that white has to contend with, and a lot of times it's actually quite easy for white to go astray because black can a lot of times get very quick counterplay on my queenside pawns. I think the line continues here f5 to kind of stop e4 and take control of the square. And I believe there are 2 plans for white here that are pretty good. I believe e4 anyway is a nice pawn sacrifice here. The point is after f takes e4, I think f3 is a move, and the point is at the cost of a pawn, you're happy to kind of pry open the position for your bishops to kind of play. Another plan in this position is actually to go for h4 and to go h4, h5, and to try to get some counterplay this way. But again, it's not necessarily a position I wanted to play without a lot of sort of advanced knowledge beyond those few moves, because black very quickly can play like queen a5, attack c3, and, I think you'd start with actually knight f6, because h5 is a little bit menacing. So maybe knight f6, I think h5, and then rook g8 is a move, getting out of the way of the h takes g6. I think that if you take on h5 right away, there's some danger with e4 and rook takes h5, and this exchange sacrifice could be extremely damning for the king on e8. So I believe they normally go rook g8 to deal with that. The position remains quite complicated because on the one hand, white has the H file, which is kind of nice. But on the other hand, again, black gets this quick counterplay with queen a5, d6, knight bd7, and knight b6. And again, my pawns can be a little bit sensitive. So I just didn't want to go down this line. So instead, I decided to play e4. And the idea with e4 is that I don't commit the knight to c3 right away, and I kind of invite black to maybe play knight f6 and play for King's Indian, but then when he plays knight f6 after knight c3, I'm way more comfortable developing because now c5 doesn't have the same consequence of hitting my knight on c3 if I push d5. So a little bit of move order games being played here. Black actually went for c5 here, and I can decide to whether I want to keep the tension or not. If I keep the tension, I could play knight f3, and go for some kind of Maroczy bind type of position. But I believe there are some nuances here because the knight hasn't committed to c6. And I think there are some ideas with queen b6 as an idea, hitting this knight on d4. I believe I've seen that before. Point being is I can't go bishop e3 to protect because queen takes b2 is a problem. So I wasn't so sure about, the positions where keeping the tension and there's an early bishop g7 and c takes d4. So I decided to press onward with d5 and just take space in the center. Taking space is almost never a bad thing. So, having the space advantage I think would be, totally fine here. And I thought now we'd probably transpose to some type of Benoni type position where black will ultimately need to break with d6. We'll play d6 and then e6 and play e takes d5. And then I think we transpose to Benoni after c takes d5 or e takes d5. So these were the structures I was kind of envisioning. The other plan potentially, this is a little bit far-fetched, but maybe black could even entertain playing a Benko-style gambit with b5. But here that didn't make so much sense because my bishop is already eyeing the b5 pawn. So yeah, you can get your counterplay on the queen side perhaps in these types of lines. But at the end of the day, I'm not really buying it because I don't even lose the right to castle. I have retained the extra pawn and I castle, whereas normally in the Benko, there's that king walk variation with king f1, g3, and king g2. So I didn't believe that, giving up a pawn here, Benko style, was super sensible. So anyways, that didn't happen. After d5, black played d6, and now I had another decision to make because, again, I'm not so sure I want to play knight c3 here. It's actually a totally fine move here because in this version of the structure, now that I've actually played e4, he can actually play f5 and actually secure the e4 square for himself. So this pawn structure is not as bad as in the previous line. Because after queen a5, it's hardly a problem. I can either defend with bishop d2, or I can actually say, you know what, feel free to take c3 because you maybe open up a diagonal for my bishop later on in the game. So this type of version would not be as bad, but I still thought that if I thought, maybe I shouldn't go knight c3. Maybe he had some ideas here. He played this system before. And I wanted to, at least get him kind of on unlevel footing where he'd have to sort of think on his own. And so I actually decided to play knight e2. And knight e2 is not very popular at all. I'd actually seen this concept in a few games where the knight can actually go, the e2 knight can go to c3, and then the b1 knight can go to d2. And that kind of was attractive to me. I remember Anand played it against Gelfand in their world championship. He actually won a game right after he'd lost a game, and it was actually the shortest game in world championship history. I believe it was like 19 or 20 moves where Gelfand blundered a piece. But white got a fresh and very original position with this knight coming to c3 and then this one coming to d2. And the point is, when the b1 knight comes to d2, after a subsequent exchange on d5 and this Benoni type of structure, then the knight is ready to come to c4. So if the c4 square is vacated, then that d2 knight has access to it. So I just thought it was an original way to play. And then the flip side, I can also just play a normal Samish type of position and go knight bc3 and f3 if I wanted. So I thought knight e2 is pretty flexible. And one of the other reasons I considered this is because a lot of times when you play knight f3 in these types of Benoni type of structures, black will play bishop g4 and bishop takes f3. And even though these positions are known to be, better for white because of the bishop pair, black does have a fairly fluid game from the standpoint that, he has this long diagonal to work with. He might try to play for b5 later with like knight a6, knight c7, rook b8, a6, and b5. And the two bishops advantage takes a long time to be realized. So I thought, you know what, I'm just going to cut out bishop g4 altogether with knight e2 because now this move would be extremely ineffectual because I could just go f3. So all those thoughts kind of landed me on the knight e2 move. Black went for knight f6 now, and now I went knight ec3. And again, you see the plan where, this one goes to c3, and then this one goes to d2. Black castled. I played bishop e2, now trying to hurry up with my development because I moved this knight from g1 already twice. And now e6, normal move, trying to play for this Benoni type of structure with e takes d5. And now I castled. And yeah, I must say I expected here some type of e takes d5 type of position, maybe rook e8. But I was a little bit surprised by black's next move, knight a6. And knight a6 is somewhat of a tricky move because, there's some lines where the knight comes to c7 and supports an eventual b5 break. But otherwise, I'm not really impressed by this knight on a6 because it's not really doing so much here. So, yeah, I just wasn't a huge fan. And I decided to kind of ignore that and get on with my own development with bishop g5. I thought now that, this knight is not supporting the one on f6 by playing knight d7, there are scenarios where this pin could be kind of annoying. Black went h6, pressuring that bishop. And I have a choice here to make which way I want to go with my bishop. Bishop h4 is entirely playable, in part because after g5, bishop g3, knight h5 isn't an option to secure the bishop pair because my bishop and queen are both eyeing the h5 square. So the bishop could be nicely saddled here. But I thought maybe after e5, my bishop isn't, really where it would want to be, and it'd probably want to be another place. But this position is totally fine. Instead of going bishop h4, I actually went bishop e3 because I thought in addition to still eyeing the h6 pawn, I also was eyeing c5. And in many positions, if the position actually becomes closed, I'm going to want to put some pressure on the c5 square and prepare the b4 break with a3 and b4. So I thought my bishop was well primed on this square to do that. After bishop e3, e5 was played. And this wasn't a huge surprise to me, actually, because the only reason why you delay e takes d5 is because maybe you'd be considering e5 yourself. Now, another way to play, and again, more in the vein of the Benoni, would be e takes d5. And then I would have gone c takes d5, and if rook e8, knight d2, and we kind of get a position where, I think white has very harmonious development with where the minor pieces are. Knight g4 is kind of stopped. Knight h5 isn't possible. My knights are both defending e4. And I just feel like white is pretty comfortable here. But this is, just a position. And now black can consider playing like knight c7 and rook b8 and trying to play b5, and very complicated game. e5 changes the contours of the position because now it's actually a closed structure and there are very clear plans for both. So the first thing you want to think about in a closed pawn structure is, where the pawn breaks come from. So if you look for black, the pawn breaks are potentially b5 and f5. Okay, fair enough. For white, the pawn breaks are either f4 or b4. So in this position, it's you kind of want to determine which break, black is probably going to play for, because that's going to determine where the pieces go. So if you look here, you can see b5 is extremely hard to get off because I have my pawn on c4, my knight on c3, my bishop on e2. So b5 is kind of not realistic. But on the flip side, f5 is actually quite realistic because the bishop is guarding that square, the pawn on g6 is guarding that square, and it's the rook on f8 is supporting it. And it's in the vein of these King's Indian type of structures, which, happen in these closed positions where they try to go f5, f4, and, pawn storm on the king side and deliver checkmate. So it was kind of clear to me that, I should try to, preempt that best I can. On the flip side, f4 is not a pawn break that's necessarily the best for me to do, even though it might be something I consider, because it actually activates this bishop on the long diagonal. And so I thought it'd be more, it'd be a little bit more intelligent to play for b4 and play a3, b4, because I have a space advantage through the middle, and if I'm able to break through on the queen side, it could be very overwhelming. So again, the game kind of takes on the contours of a King's Indian defense. The only difference is that this pawn is on c5 rather than on c7. And you could say that's actually a better version because it's harder for me to get this b4 pawn break. Normally you get the pawn break on c5 and that's already not possible. So I think, there's pluses and minuses to this position. The one thing that's in my favor, though, is that my bishops on e2 and e3 are really well placed for a kingside pawn storm, because there are two ways I can handle this f5 break. I can take on f5, and after g takes f5, play f4 and give black hanging pawns. Or I can play f3, and then after f4, drop my bishop back to f2. And, normally when you have your bishops on e2 and f2, it's very hard for black to break through on the king side. So, I think this is a position for white that's just better. But there's a lot of dynamism for both sides. So, anyways, after e5, I went knight d2, just continuing my development. This knight needs to get out. I want to get closer to connecting my rooks. Fair enough. And black now went queen e7, reasonable move. And now I went a3. And the point is, I'm trying to very quickly get my initiative off on the queen side. Black now went knight d7. I think that's a multi-purpose move. It reinforces the c5 pawn a little bit, and it also prepares this f5 break. And I had a real question here about, what I thought of the move f5, because again, f5 is always something that's kind of desirable for black in these structures to get counterplay. And I need to kind of figure out, do I want to take it, or do I want to let him go to f4? And I kind of reasoned that, I was probably going to take on f5 and go f4. So I went king h1, and my idea with this was that if f5 is played, I would take. And, a rook takes f5 is not good, because now you surrender the e4 square, and I could play knight e4, and, this would be a beautiful blockade on e5, and I'd have a nice positional edge here. So g takes f5 would be the move you play. But after g takes f5, now I have f4, and this position remains complicated, but the idea is that I play against black's hanging pawns. The point is, this pawn tension is favorable for me because I can take whenever I want and then uncover a pressure on f5. And black may not want to take, because after e takes f4, bishop takes f4, you see both these pawns are split. And even though, even though black is basically trying to conduct a kingside attack and secures the e5 square for the knight, endgames will be unfavorable for black, because these pawns are weak and are problematic targets. The other thing is that this bishop on c8, actually behind the f-pawn, is not very good because it's not participating in the action. So, this bishop takes a ton of moves just to get active, and then even then, it's on g6, it's still behind the pawn because it can't go to h5. So these type of structures, I still feel are whitest for choice. So that was my idea with king h1, to just preempt this f5 break and then take and play f4. Another way, by the way, in this position after f4 is white can try to play for e4, right? And the position is closed. But the problem here is now, this pawn is, might be a little bit sensitive guarding e4, and I can play for g4. And so I can consider a move like rook g1 and ultimately trying to play for g4. And, if I'm able to get g4 in cleanly, e4 is going to be a huge, huge problem. And even the king might be a little bit weak, honestly. Now, I will say this structure is remarkably similar to one that was actually played, that actually Carlsen played with black in his round 1 game at the Grenke Chess Classic, which was running concurrently with this tournament. And in that game, Carlsen came up with the plan of playing bishop takes c3, b takes c3, knight f6. And the point is that he kind of slowed down h5, or he slowed down this g4 break, and he actually argued that these double pawns were weaknesses and that the bishop on e3 didn't have a really great diagonal to take advantage of the bishop pair because this diagonal shut down. But white was actually much better in that game, and even though Carlsen managed to win because he's a stronger player, Vincent Keimer had a fantastic position and did well to get the position he got. So I was not too worried about an exchange on c3 and this type of theme. Anyways, this did not happen. f5 was not played, and instead black went for king h7. And it's a funny thing that king h7 was played, is because I kind of stumbled on the right plan here, and it's really just because of king h7. Against any other move, I probably wouldn't have gone for this, but king h7 just seems so suspicious to me because in many lines, you actually don't want your king on the same diagonal as your f5 pawn break because it can be pinned in uncomfortable ways. And so instead, if you want to move your king to the side, it's actually much better to go h8 because your king is secure behind the fianchettoed bishop on g7. King h7, it's vulnerable. And because it's vulnerable, I actually played g4. And the reason I played g4 is because I thought now f5 is pretty much an impossibility because if you play f5, I take a few times, and rook takes f5 is not possible because of bishop d3, and you can see the issue with the king on h7. And on the flip side, if you don't take on f5, well, I've also managed to secure the e4 square forever. So this is just a fantastic position if I just reinforce the pawn, go rook g1, and I'm going to crash through on g6. So this position is actually terrible for black if you actually try to force in f5, and you see how king h7 makes f5 a lot harder. Now, it's a funny thing that king h7 was played because I probably would not have rushed to play g4, but it just seemed so tempting when he went king h7. And in fact, a move earlier when I played king h1, the computer is actually recommending g4 as one of its top choices, putting the squeeze on f5. And what does that tell me? Well, it tells me that after f5, I can take anyway, and that this position, even here, is extremely advantageous for me because I've managed to secure the e4 square for my pieces. And so after king h1 here, let's say knight f6 and, let's say knight e4 just to blockade that square, white is for choice here because these pieces will all flood towards the king side quite quickly, and I can use the G file as a huge asset in getting at the black king. So even in this position, g4 would have been a really, really strong idea. And I guess I'm just sort of fortunate that he played king h7, that he kind of stumbled into it. So after g4, black acknowledged that f5 probably didn't make a lot of sense, and he went for bishop f6. And there is some merit to this plan because he's kind of arguing, now that you've weakened these dark squares around your g4 pawn, right? The squares adjacent to your pawn are usually weak when you push them, when you push the pawn. He's trying to take advantage. So this king's Indian bishop, which is sometimes quite a bad piece, he's trying to trade it off with bishop g5 and hammer at the dark squares. Interesting plan, but the problem is I can beat him to that square by playing, or specifically g5, by playing knight f3, and that's what I did. And I said, you know what, well, you do want to trade off these dark square bishops, but I'm not going to let you, and if you want to force a trade, you're going to give me the bishop pair. Black actually obliged and went for bishop g5, but I was happy because now after knight takes g5, h takes g5, even though, it seems like he has a nice clamp on f4, and, it seems unclear how I'm going to kind of break through on the king side, I have the bishop pair, and that means I have the trumps. And the other issue is, even now, f5 is not a move that can be played because I'll take twice and get the e4 square for my pieces. So he kind of is going to have to just kind of huddle back, and he doesn't have any effective pawn breaks. And this is a huge, huge deal for me because in the meantime, I still have two pawn breaks that I can go for. One is b4, as we talked about before, and now the other is actually h4 because, if I'm able to pry open the h-file with the two bishops, I might get some attack going on the dark squares. So I evaluate this position to be significantly better for white. After h takes g5, I went queen d2, just connecting my rooks and putting pressure on g5. It kind of forces black's response f6. And I really also like that I forced f6 because now this knight really doesn't have any great squares to go to. It's kind of floundering on the second rank, and both these knights are very clumsy. They're not doing anything. So I think the space advantage connected with the potential pawn breaks just are really problematic for black. So now I have to improve. I have to find a plan. I thought that playing for h4 made a lot of sense, so I decided to go king g2. scoop my rook over to rook h1. And now black has to be very quick to do the same, because if he allows h4 with the rook on h1, it's going to be decisive, because let's say he just toggles back and forth, rook b8, rook a8. Well, now after he has to take, and after he takes with check, I can play bishop h6 if the king goes to g7, and if he goes king g8, I can double. And, this infiltration will just be very painful. So he has to rush to get his rook to the h-file. So after king g2, he went rook h8, fair enough. And I went rook h1, shifting my rook over. And after king g7, he's managed to stop me from playing h4. So he's managed to parry my first threat. And he's done well to do so. So kudos to black. But there are a few ideas still in the position. Well, first of all, I can play for b4. I also should have considered just putting this knight on b5, because if I play knight b5, his queen is tied down to the d6 pawn, and his knight also can't retreat back to c7. So knight b5 was something I should have considered. Another interesting plan is actually to play h4 anyway. And the point is that after g takes h4, I go g5. And the point is I try to break open the structure and argue that h4 pawn is weak. And white is even better here, I believe. But I thought this was a little bit too risky. And after f5, it seems like black is getting a little bit too much counterplay for my taste. Even though after f4, I think there's, the complications probably would be fine for white. So instead of that, I decided to slow play it and went h3, just shoring up my g4 pawn. Sometimes thinking about playing rook h2 and rook h1, actually, but also just saying, you know what, I don't have h4 yet. Maybe I'll come to that later. So after h3, the play shifts to the other side of the board. Black went knight b6, I guess trying to, eye c4 and get some oxygen here. And I actually played bishop d3, eyeing the f5 pawn, f5 break a little bit, although it wasn't going to be played because g5 is hanging. But also, just reinforcing my pawns a little bit and just, making a useful move. A little bit more to the point, a little bit more incisive, and a move I actually missed tactically was b4. And the point is that the pawn on b4 is actually not hanging because there's bishop takes b6 tactic, and you can see the rook is pinned so you can't recapture. So that was something I should have considered, but I just kind of missed that important detail. And I thought, well, these knights on a6 and b6 aren't really doing very much anyway, so I thought I can afford to be a little bit patient with my play because, again, white has no pawn, or black has no pawn break, and as you may have heard me say before, no pawn break, no plan. So I'm the one that's for choice, and I can sort of dictate the pace here. So after bishop d3, black now went bishop d7, connecting the rooks. It was about time. And now I went b3. And again, I'm just being very patient. A little bit too patient, perhaps, sure. But I'm just taking away the a4 square from the knight and the bishop. And, just shoring up everything. And kind of just asking black what they're going to try to do. Black went rook a b8. And this was the first semblance of a plan. I thought now black might be trying to play for b5 and can consider playing knight a8 and then knight c7 to try and push that through. And, that's the first kind of sign that he's trying to do something. So I had to kind of get going now. I went rook ag1. And the reason I did that is because I was thinking I still had illusions of potentially playing h4. So I was trying to prepare it by going rook g1 and then king f1, and then try to break through with g5. So that was my idea there. And, I was just trying to see, what black would do here. Black played knight a8, ignoring my ideas on the king side and trying to press onward with trying to get this queen side break with b5. And now I actually went knight b5 because I decided, you know what, I don't really want to allow this pawn b5 break, so I'm just kind of going to occupy the square and just do that because I thought it would be fairly incisive. And my other point is that taking on b5 with the bishop, even though it doubles my pawns, I thought would be very bad because now the bishop wouldn't be eyeing g4 anymore, and so I might have this h4 break. Maybe the break would be even more devastating if the bishop is lost. So after knight b5, let's say bishop takes b5 is played. After c takes b5, the knight has to go to this knight has to go to c7, and you can see these knights are very bad. And I might just have h4 as an option here, honestly. Point being, if g takes h4, g5, and I rip open the position with my bishops. Now, I don't have to be this aggressive, and there's also a positional approach. And the positional approach is actually, just as clean, or cleaner, actually. I can actually go b4, trying to break open the c file here, and maybe even get play on the a file. And if black goes knight b6, I could go b takes c5, d takes c5, and rook c1, now pressuring c5. The only way to hold on to this pawn would be to go knight d7, but now the line continues, and I have bishop e2. And the point is, now I'm threatening d6, forking. And, we all know the queen is a bad blockader, so queen b6 would be, fairly ill-advised, because the queen would not be able to hold this blockade. But the problem is that if you play knight e8, I actually can push onward with d6. And tactically, you can't take on d6, because after queen takes, there's rook hd1, and you see these knights are hanging. So the point isn't that I calculated this all out, and that this was something that I saw from far away. But the point is that when you have a space advantage and the two bishops, and you accumulate the types of advantages I did, tactics just tend to appear. So you just have to trust in the underlying fundamentals that are in your favor, and then good things tend to happen. So anyways, after knight b5, black did not take and actually went knight a c7, but this was a mistake, because the point is, with knight b5 also had the point of hitting a7, and this is a free pawn. So now I played knight takes a7, and it was clear to me now that I must be completely winning, because in addition to having the space advantage, now I have an extra pawn on the queen side to push with b4. So I felt very good here. Black played b5, though, trying to at least get some activity for the lost pawn. And I actually went for b4. And this is the perfect moment to play b4, because now that this pawn has moved from, to b5, he can't reinforce the c5 pawn with b6. And so you can see that this chain is actually, this closed position that was kind of the only way he was holding on, is actually completely collapsing. So after b4, b takes c4 is played, bishop takes c4, c takes b4, a takes b4, and the position is ripping open. I have an extra pawn, I have the two bishops, and I can even shift gears with rook a1 at a moment's notice. And the c6 square is weak, so even knight c6 becomes an option. Black played knight b5, trying to activate some pieces. And I actually willingly gave up my bishop pair with bishop takes b5, because this knight on a7 was such a powerful piece, because it not only eyed the c8 square, stopping the rook from coming over, it also eyed the c6 square, and I thought I could also recoup my bishop on b5 by just playing knight takes b5. And trades here seemed fine for me. I played rook a1, keeping the tension. Again, this is something I didn't do super well in the last game, but here I was a little bit better, because there's no rush to actually take on b5 with my knight, because my knight's also doing a great job of, again, restricting the rook from coming over and controlling the c6 square. So I don't have to rush to get rid of it. Black now went knight c7, and actually, now I decide to release the tension with knight takes b5, but that's actually not the best move. It is a winning move, and there are many ways to roam here. But why don't you pause the video and try to find the best move for white in this position? All right, the best move for white in this position is actually to play knight c6. And the point is that after bishop takes c6, which is forced because I was forking the rook and the queen, and d takes c6, I have two connected passed pawns and a rook that can arrive on a7 at any moment. I actually saw this, but I was not keen on the position after knight b5, because I thought I'm temporarily held up with rook a7, which is the move I want to play. But even here, I can go rook a5, and this knight is not particularly secure. if rook's fc8 is played to attack my c6 pawn, I can actually go queen d3, and you can see the knight really can't go forward in the position without losing material, and so the knight is forced backward. And well, if the knight's forced backward, now I can go b5 and press onward, and you can see two connected passed pawns are winning. So I just missed the fact that I have this rook a5 move after knight b5 and queen d3 to follow, and that the knight wasn't secure. And to be honest, I think another reason why I didn't want to go for this is because I didn't want the pawn structure to be a little bit imbalanced and for him to have a pawn break. Whereas in the position after knight takes b5, which I played, you can see that I'm a pawn up and black has no pawn breaks to speak of. So I just figured it was there was less counterplay for black. But it turns out if I calculate a little bit more, I'd see that the other way was actually a faster win. But I haven't spoiled anything here, and I went for rook a6, now trying to double on the file and make use of my space advantage. Because I have two advantages here: the space advantage, the b pawn, of course, and now actually a target on d6. So maybe three advantages. Black now went rook b7, trying to, I think, double and maybe think about attacking b4 one day. And I went rook ha1, just trying to double on the a file. Now, I don't have the entry square on a7, which is a little bit frustrating, but I'm still, for choice here. Rook hb8 was played, and I could see now that maybe he was trying to get some counterplay with knight d4, and I didn't love that. I didn't love that I allowed this. Because now if, let's say I make a move like king g1, for instance, and after knight d4, the b pawn is attacked, and he's also threatening some nasty forks. And okay, king g1 is probably the worst move I could have made, because he's also threatening knight f3 check. And I just didn't love scenarios where I'm actually having to give up my bishop and give him a lot of activity like so, because now he has a chance to hold the game. So instead of allowing him to have two rooks on the b file, I decided, let's have him have one rook. And I decided to play rook a8 because I thought with only one rook on the board, it's a lot harder for him to attack my b pawn. So after rook a8, queen d7 was played, and now I took on b8 and went rook a6. And the point is that now that there's only one rook on the b pawn, I can continue doing what I'm doing, encroach on black's queen side, and maybe nestle myself on the c6 square potentially, and just kind of invade with my queen. And in the interim, the knight doesn't have any squares it can go forward on. So I think I'm fine here. Black now went king f7, just kind of waiting for me to do something. And I went queen c2, just keeping everything in place. Now I'm also maybe threatening to invade with queen c6 or rook c6. Black went knight d4. Now that my queen was off the square, I can't actually just win a pawn right away. But I have such good control in the position that I actually just played queen c4. And the point is that the knight on d4 is frozen unless it wants to go backwards because I have rook a7. And now I'm actually threatening to just take the knight and, win a pawn. Black went knight b5 back, and now I went rook c6, and now I'm slowly trying to encroach now because now I'm cutting off the oxygen from the queen to the knight on b5, and it means that this rook on b8 is tied to this knight because if you move it away, it's just hanging. On the flip side, the knight on b5 is paralyzed because now I'm also have rook c7 if it moves. So you can see I'm slowly tying black down before I go for the decisive push. Black went rook b7. All I can do is wait. And now I went bishop b6. And this was the second part of my plan, was that since I cut the oxygen off from the knight, from the queen to the knight, now I'm cutting it off from the rook to the knight. And you see now the knight is just very, very insecure. And this is just a nice winning maneuver because I'm just slowly encroaching and he has no counterplay, and this is pretty much it. Black now went knight a7, retreating the knight, and I decided to transpose to a winning position with bishop takes a7 because after rook takes and b5, the other issue is he still has to remain passive because his king on f7 is so weak. So I always have rook c7 ideas if he leaves the 7th rank. So he just tied down. After queen d8, I went b6, just pushing onward. And then after rook d7, I went rook c7. And you can see that my pawn is slowly marching home. Black played king e7, only move to kind of keep the game going, just a few more moves. But now I went rook takes d7, and after queen takes, I went queen c6. And you can see, even in the end game, this extra pawn is enduring. So it's just decisive. f5 was played. I guess just one more spite move, if you will. And I just decided to play queen g takes f5, g takes f5, and queen takes d7. And in this position, my opponent finally resigned. The point is that after king takes d7, e takes f5, there's no way the king can stop both pawns. And, that just, marks the end of the game. So I thought that was a fairly interesting game. We have this scenario where it's a modern opening that turns into a Benoni opening that turns into a King's Indian, if you will. And I think it was pretty instructive because you get to see, how to play a close position, what levers there are, what to do and what not to do, and so on. And how a space advantage can be really enduring throughout the game, as it was in this one. All right, thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.